Hello, and welcome to the From the Shadows podcast. I am the producer, Jason Lewis. I would like to thank you for tuning in to the From the Shadows podcast. And without further ado, here is your host, Shane Grove.
Welcome, everyone, to the From the Shadows podcast. I'm your host, Shane Grove, hunkered down here in the middle of the coronavirus scare of 2020. With me tonight, but not in the same room because of the coronavirus scare of 2020, is the super producer, Jason.
Hey, how's it going, everybody?
Boy, you sound like you're really in good spirits. Is that because you're not in the same room with us tonight, or is that...
Don't tell him what them little beastie viruses may contain.
and also with us tonight is the judge.
Good evening, everyone.
How are you doing, facing a little bit of extra turmoil in the county this last week, Judge?
Well, it's been a little bit complicated, and people are scared, and people are worried we're going to shut down, and people aren't going to get paid, and it's been quite the challenge. But I think we got a good grip on it, and this is a good opportunity tonight to talk about some fun things that we're interested in and get our minds off those types of, burdens that are weighing on people. So I hope people have fun listening tonight whenever this airs.
Absolutely.
So speaking of getting paid, are we still having our backroom poker game in the judge's chambers tomorrow then afternoon? While this is
Absolutely not.
So joining us on tonight's episode is a prolific, and I do mean prolific, author from here in Ohio, one Mr. WilliamGKrejci.
Mm-hmm.
You there, William?
Oh, I am indeed. Yes. How are you guys doing this evening?
Hey, you're not supposed to sound disinterested until we're about a half hour into.
I was refilling my glass.
Okay.
Oh yeah. Oh, sorry about that. Distracted for a moment.
So
thank
Bill,
you guys for having me on. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity to come on and spill the beans with you guys.
hey, we're excited to have you on. I've talked to some other podcast hosts that have had you as a guest, and they just did nothing but rave about you. So,
cool.
So you got the bar's been set a little bit high. Do not disappoint us.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I hope not to disappoint.
So Bill, tell us how you got interested in, and kind of give us maybe a little rundown of some of the titles, and I think people will figure out what your specialty is or what your main interest.
Okay. All right. So I'll start a little bit with the Franklin Castle, and I'll go from there. As far as the Franklin Castle goes, and how I ultimately got involved with writing a book about that, we have to go back a long time ago. Okay. I was about 5 years old, and we're driving down the road, and we're taking the scenic route home from my grandparents' house in Cleveland. At the time, I was living in Avon Lake, and we're coming up to the corner of West 44th Street in Franklin, and my dad says, as we're all piled in the family van, Dad goes, "Hey guys, look, that's a real haunted house." And he points out the front windshield at Franklin Castle right across the intersection. And my jaw just about hit the floor. And I'm like, what? Because it's like my father, he never talked about anything like that. So for him to say something as outlandish as that, I'm like, oh my God, it must be true then. Yeah, it's got to be real. So he started going on a little bit about it, and then I had a million questions. He's like telling me some of the things that he's read in the paper some years earlier, and he's going on about this, that, and he's like, oh, well, he's like, you know what, you're just gonna have to look for it. And every now and again, they would have it on TV, and or it'd be in the newspaper article, and they talk about it, and I'd be like all about it. And sometimes if we weren't in a hurry to get home, I'd make them drive past, which I found out people still do. they make their dad and mom drive past the castle so they could take a look at it. That's kids still do that today. So I always had this interest in the Franklin Castle. So we'll leave it there for a little bit, and I'll get back to that. As far as writing goes, I've always had an interest in telling stories. Always loved local interest. Urban lore was a big one. So I grew up in Lorain County, so a big one for us out there was Gore Orphanage. That was like the huge one when we were kids. And you might be familiar with that one.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's a great story.
How much, now you haven't written a book on Gore Orphanage. Yes? No,
well, yeah, it's in there. It's in a new book that I just wrote. The book just came out back in September called Ghosts and Legends of Northern Ohio.
Oh,
I took that one very literally. So I wrote about the legends associated with ghost stories here, found in pretty much from Pennsylvania to Indiana, and then from Michigan and the lake down to about Route 22. So about the northern third of the state, and just kind of included every little legend in there. And I started with the quote-unquote Helltown legend, which is Boston Township, Peninsula, Cuyahoga Valley National Park, pretty much. And I concluded the book with the Gore Orphanage legend. Started with the telling of the legend, like I always love to, because you always got to put it in context, and then get into the history and tell what really happened. So I was hooked on things like that. It was the crybaby bridges, the quote unquote witches' graves, or the haunted cemeteries. Then you get these other little ghost stories about, oh, that's a haunted tavern, or oh, don't go near that railroad crossing, it's haunted. There were some kids that were wiped out there back in the 50s. You know, stories like that. So I always got really intrigued by these great stories. I also, though, while doing the research for the castle, I started really getting involved in castle research for Franklin Castle around 1992. And in 2005, so 13 years later, I met a man named John Myers who was also researching it. We decided to pool our resources and write a book. So while writing said book, a couple of years later, I had the fortune of meeting Professor Walter C. Leedy. He was the head of the Art and Architecture Department at Cleveland State at the time, and I met him about a month before he passed away. He was fighting leukemia at the time. And we were talking about this because he was very interested in the castle. And one of his contemporaries, a friend of his, was Professor Dora Louise Whedon, who was the great-granddaughter of the people that built the Franklin Castle. So that's how I got to meet him. And he gave me the best bit of advice, kind of. He said, if you want to be a rich famous author, do not write nonfiction. And I kind of looked at him funny. I'm like, what do you mean? He had written a couple of books about the Terminal Tower. And he said, I still have to have my regular job. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, of course you do. Most do. He's like, if you want to make $1 million as a writer, if that's what you want to do, write fiction, because that appeals to almost everybody, not local interest nonfiction. And I'm, okay, so I kind of put the Franklin Castle book on the back burner a little bit. And
wait, I got to stop you.
Yeah.
I got to stop you right there. So does that mean that I'm going to make $1 million? Because...
Well, yeah, I was thinking, well, I knew I wasn't going to make $1 million, but I'm thinking, well, what can I do to write a really good book? Because, growing up, you always hear the story of the guy who sets out to, or girl who sets out to write the great American novel. And occasionally someone does it. And I'm thinking, well, who does that? What constitutes a great American novel? Certainly not mystery novels. I said, the hell with it. And I decided I'd start writing mystery novels anyway. So I started writing the Jack Sullivan mystery series, and there are 3 of them. I was never going to really publish any of them until I met a girl named Becky. And she was very encouraging and really, really pushed me and said, you know what, here's something that we found online. Here's a great way that you can self-publish. And I looked into it, and I'm like, holy hell. So I did. So at the encouragement of her, I self-published my first 3 novels. And then we got married. And then she became my wife. And then 7 months later, we separated, and then 8 months after that, we got divorced. So I wasn't really married long enough to do any long-term damage. But that's why if you pick up my third mystery novel, you're going to find Becky, who on a summer night in De Rivera Park by the fountain at Putin Bay said yes. And I keep thinking the fourth novel will say, to Becky, who on a cold March afternoon told me to piss off. And after that, I will never dedicate a book to anyone ever again. I will send out my sincere thanks, but that's about the extent of it. So I did. I started. The first thing that I published and put out there were 3 mystery novels, and I really do mean that she really did encourage me, and I am eternally grateful for that, and many other things to my ex-wife. So as far as writing or getting anything actually published by an actual publisher went, at the time that we were going through our troubles, I was working on this one project. Somebody had asked me if I could find out if the bar that they operated here in Cleveland used to be a graveyard. And I kind of just stopped in my tracks, much like I did when my father pointed at the Franklin Castle and said, "Kids, look, that's a real haunted house." And I looked at this person and said, "Why would you suspect that your bar is built on a graveyard?" Thinking that, okay, paranormal activity or something right out of the movie Poltergeist. And she says, because Uncle Mike Carney dug up a tombstone in the backyard of the bar while he was operating the place. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. So I went down, saw the tombstone, took a few pictures, went online, started bringing up old maps, title transfers, everything. I threw in every resource I knew because I have a real knack for doing property research. So I'm throwing everything at it, everything in my toolbox I'm trying to find. I can't find squat. What I am finding, though, on some of these old maps from the 1870s are little gray shaded in squares that say CEM next to them, indicating a cemetery. I'm like, wait a minute. I know that spot. There's no cemetery. So I started going to these spots to see what's left of them. In some cases, there are tombstones in the woods. And I started finding more and more of them, enough to write a book about. And I pitched it to History Press with a title of Beneath Our Feet, and they changed it to Buried Beneath Cleveland, and that became Lost Cemeteries of Cuyahoga County, my first published novel book through History Press, local interest nonfiction. I found over 50 graveyards in the greater Cleveland area that nobody knew existed, because they have houses, gas stations, grocery stores, parking lots built on top of them. Some of them are in the woods and there are ruins left, and in some cases it's just somebody's driveway or their front yard or their backyard. Interestingly, also, as a footnote to that, I found out that the bar that they dug up the tombstone, it was not a cemetery.
It was just a one-shot. Just a one-shot.
It was just the one tombstone. Yes, it's not a graveyard. The girl whose tombstone it was, she was 2 years old. She died in 1871. She's buried in Garfield Heights, and she's still buried there. When her father died about 15 years later, they replaced her tombstone with one that matched her father's and her brother's in this family burial plot. So tombstones do travel also. So it probably made its way. Interestingly, that happened the same year that they built the bar, 1887. So tombstones travel, and it probably made its way north to Cleveland. Was then repurposed as probably a paving stone going from the back door to the piss house. So that was probably what it was used for. So yeah, paver going to the outhouse out back. So that's what and it was the most basic way I found it. I went to findagrave.com, and there it was. I'm like, okay, well, that makes more sense. But it's interesting that because of my friends asking me to find out if their bar was built on a graveyard, because they dug up a tombstone for a 2-year-old girl who died in 1870 or 1871, that little girl who died over 150 years ago, or about 150 years ago, would change my life and get me published. Weird. That's fate. That's how things happen sometimes.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
So what
after
happened?
that?
Before you leave that book, I think I have some questions about that book.
Yeah.
I think Jason does too, because he actually mentioned that book to me earlier today.
Yeah.
But what? So what happened to these graves? I mean, did they not move the graves when they just built something?
In some cases, they did move them, and in some cases, they simply moved what they could find. In some cases, we've all seen Poltergeist, I think, the original, not the lousy knockoff that came out a few years ago. But in some cases, you only moved the headstones. You left the bodies, didn't you? But you only moved the headstones.
Yeah.
So that's the case, too. I even joke about that movie in the introduction. But in some cases... and one of the places was haunted. I'll tell you about that in a moment. But in some cases, they moved nothing at all. Headstones, bodies, you name it, it's all still there.
See, that was my
question.
question.
Very hard to get to.
That's what I was going to ask you about.
Yeah, some of them are still there. Let's see. Let me cite a few cases. In one case where they moved the cemetery, there was the old Bedford burying ground, and this is one of the chapters in there, and this is really unfortunate. They were moving it in the 1880s, so to where the Bedford Cemetery is located now, just simply across the street. And the reason they did this, they were extending a railroad line across it. Now, when they went to move this one guy's wife, he wanted her casket opened. He wanted to look upon her again. Okay, they did weird things back in the 1800s, and he expected them to open the casket, and as long as the casket is well sealed and well preserved, the remains will remain intact and very presentable many years later. So he expected them to open the casket and find her in a state of preservation, but then, of course, when the air hits the remains, they begin to deteriorate, so he just wanted to look for a moment and then have them close it up. They opened up the casket, and expecting to find her with her hands across her arms, they found her body contorted in a very distorted and terrifying manner, and the inside lining of the casket torn to hell. She had been buried alive.
Oh, boy.
Oh, my goodness.
That appears in a newspaper article, and the article is stated, a horrifying discovery, and it talks about how while they were moving the cemetery, and it was right then, it was the day after it had happened, that he was horrified to find out that his wife had been buried alive.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, it was pretty bad news. So that's one where they moved the entire cemetery. One where they moved what they could find. Well, that would be, let's see, the old Ohio City Cemetery is a good example. And the first Ohio City Cemetery, this was located here in Ohio City on the west side of Cleveland. And what they would move, or what they claimed that they moved, was moved to Monroe Street Cemetery, which is now the oldest cemetery on the west side. So the original site, they built a firehouse on top of it. And around 1903, they tore down the firehouse to build a new one, and that's when they discovered coffins underneath it. And there were full coffins, and some old-timer came up and said, oh, yeah, we buried our daughter here in 1836, and this guy had to be in his 90s, by my best estimate, if he had a daughter buried there in 1836. He's like, well, and then the following year they told us that we had to move the cemetery, and he looks down and sees all these open coffins there. He's like, now I wonder if the people we paid to do the job ever did it. So those remains were buried somewhere secret that night. But you'll go through Monroe Street Cemetery and you'll find one or two tombstones that do predate the 1836 opening, and those are stones that were moved, where they just moved the headstones. Interestingly, though, that firehouse had a reputation, before they even knew any of this, of being haunted. It was Engine House 6. It would have, the bell would ring inside while nobody was inside the firehouse. The horses in there for the pumper team would freak out some nights. One guy went down to light the furnace, and as he reached for the tinderbox on the ledge, he said that a ghostly skeletal hand reached out of the wall and grabbed at him. He would not go back down there again. Another fireman staying the night there was having somebody pulling the blankets off him. And finally, he jumped at the person after freaking out a few times, and everyone said, it's not us, it's not us. Finally, he dove at the person, and the person he dove at shot up like a rocket through the ceiling. That fireman died about 3 or 4 weeks later. So it was really, when they found out that this firehouse had been built on top of a cemetery. There is no longer a firehouse at this time. If anyone listening is familiar, or even if you guys are familiar with the west side of Cleveland, the Ohio City neighborhood, have you ever heard of the West Side Market?
Yes, I have.
Cleveland.
I frequent there. Yeah.
Immediately to the south of the West Side Market on the south side of Lorraine Avenue is a RTA station where the rapid transit pulls up for the Regional Transit Authority. There's that. There's a road called Gearing and a road called Abbey, and then the northeast corner of what's now called Market Square. It's all about to be redeveloped. That is the old cemetery. It has a rapid station and a road over top of it and part of a parking lot. So,
that's
they're redeveloped it. So if they do find some more bones there, well, we'll know who they are roughly, kind of. So that did end up becoming my first book. Some of them you can go up into the woods. One of my favorites is it's out in Moreland Hills. It's Moreland Hills. Sagamore Hills, I think. It's the old, and it's near Bedford. It's on Dunham Road, over by Tinker's Creek Road, and this would be the old Gleason Homestead Cemetery. And if you go to the top of the hill to the east of Dunham Road, and it was called Egypt Mound, it's an old graveyard up there, and there are still tombstone remnants up there, as well as the headstone for Edmund Gleason, whose father had owned the old tavern at the front of the road. But Edmund had also built the old stone house that's on the corner of Tinker's Creek Road and Canal Road, which still stands today. He built that in 1854, and he died a few months later. It's very sad.
Gee. So that's like a family. That's like an old family cemetery. Then that's just.
It is. Yeah, it is. Okay. Now it's in the middle of a metro park, so it's very hard to get to, though. And anytime anyone wants to go exploring, I always tell them, dress appropriately. There are better times of the year than others to go, and I say this because of wildlife would be the best way to say this. I came out of underdressed. I came out of one area wearing shorts and almost like flip-flops with sandals, and I came out and I had a tick on my leg. So be careful. Yeah. No, he hadn't bitten me yet. So, and I discovered that. I'm like, whoa, holy moly. And another time I was looking for, down near Cuyahoga Valley National Park, I was looking for one tombstone, narrow meadow. And I'm looking around, I'm looking through this pasture, and I damn near trip right over a hornet's nest, which usually you see on the top of a tree.
Right.
Or something like that. No, this was made 2.5 feet up in the grass, right there in the tall grass.
Oh my goodness!
And I froze solid, and because if they were active, I'd have been stung to death, bald-faced hornets. I'm mildly allergic, and I freeze, and I'm about to run, and I stop, and I'm like, wait a minute, it's December, they're dormant, and it's a good thing I didn't run, because about 10, 15 feet away in the direction I would have ran, I would have run into yet another hornet's nest. So yeah, terrified of hornets. That's one of the two
you're
things
okay
I'm
with
afraid of. The other being tornadoes.
You're okay with the tombstones, but the hornets really.
Yeah, tombstones don't bother me. A tombstone is just a beautifully carved, in most cases, a beautifully carved piece of stone. I'm not even afraid of. I'm afraid of no ghost. I have no problem living where I live because it doesn't really bother me. So that was the first.
An interesting. Just to throw an interesting interjection, I was just watching behind the scenes of the movies Ghostbusters, and they contacted Ray Parker Jr. and said, hey, we want you to write a song for the movie. They gave him 2 weeks, and he came back with the song, that became a massive hit. He wrote it in 2 weeks. And you're still saying it. People are still singing it.
Right.
Yeah, here it is. 35 years later, and we're still saying. It's still part of pulp culture.
Yeah, but do you know he blatantly stole the bass line and the melody from "I Want a New Drug."
Oh, you're right. It does sound a lot like you know what.
He does.
By Huey Lewis in the news.
Huey Lewis in the news, absolutely.
Huey Lewis ended up they sued him, and Huey Lewis is credited as a co-writer on Ghostbusters theme song.
No kidding.
No.
I never knew that either.
In fairness to Ray Parker Jr., they only gave him 2 weeks.
Yeah,
So
believe me.
So he basically looped somebody else's song.
Yeah.
I got wasted off my ass one night with my brother when he was going through a divorce some years earlier, and we wrote a song in one night, and it's called. It's one of those songs. It's like it sounds like a sea shanty. It's a nautical tune, and it's one of the only songs ever banned from Putin Bay, Ohio. And it's called "My Last Ride on the SS Filthy Whore." So, but it comes with a legal disclaimer. I tell everybody, no, the song is about a boat. It's about a boat. It's not about my brother's ex-wife, Sarah Lesher, who lives on Rollo Road in Wellington, Ohio, who divorced him in 2005, took him for the house, the car, the kids, all their money, all their property, and had been having an affair on it with another guy for the last year of their marriage. It's not about her at all. It is about a boat. And the song is called My Last Ride on the SS Filthy Whore.
You know what's an interesting parallel to that, since we're all talking about Ray Parker Jr., he did have another semi-hit song is "I'm in Love with the Other Woman."
With the other woman, yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
That is an interesting.
Because his life was fine until she blew his mind.
Yeah, there was even a video to that song. Yeah, I remember that too.
Jeez.
What do you mean? Remember, you still have a cassette tape in your car, Jason.
I gotta say this. I'm really looking forward to the new Ghostbusters movie coming out. I mean, I saw that whole behind the things scene things where they were going to call it Ghost Breakers, and that thing they put on Netflix, and I was like, oh, that's so weird.
That was
how it's supposed to be John Belushi, and I can't. I'm trying to picture the movie with John Belushi, and I'm like, that'd be interesting. Hard to picture though.
Yeah, it would have been.
Well, then it was supposed to be John Candy was supposed to. Was also supposed to be in which I can't remember. Egon's part, I think.
And interestingly, Harold Ramis was supposed to play in Animal House, which he co-wrote. So Schoenstein was supposed to be played by Harold Ramis. But they cut him at the last minute. So it's cool that he kind of got the Ghostbusters gig though, and that's one of the. He's always going to be known
for anybody for anybody just tuning in. Yes, this is 80s trivia night on the Shadows podcast.
I'm a child.
Well, to throw in even bigger trivia to you, was they originally tagged Christopher Walken to play Han Solo in the original Star Wars.
Oh, don't!
I heard that.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you imagine that if he would have actually got
Nick
that
Nolte.
role?
I was told by Nick Nolte. They were ready with Nick Nolte, and then they had the Carpenter come in and audition, and Han Solo's got a facelift all of a sudden.
Can you imagine Nick Nolte flying the Millennium Falcon and then pulling out?
I've tried to picture that since I've heard that. I can't picture it.
Yeah,
I mean, he was of course many years younger. I don't know, it'd be like having like Gary Busey or something like that. It could have been worse. I mean, no offense, Gary Busey. Gary Busey
would have been perfect. I mean, you saw his Oscar award. Didn't he win the Oscar for Best Actor in Stephen King's Silver Bullet?
Yeah, you know what?
Yeah, I'm being facetious, but
the one part at the very end of the original Star Wars where he goes, "Whoa! All right, kids, you're all clear. Let's close and get out of here." I can see Gary Busey saying that.
But wouldn't Gary
Busey look so maniacal too, though?
Gary Busey would have wrecked the Millennium Falcon, right? I mean, let's be honest.
Yeah, but you could see Gary Busey when they're in the Death Star, and he looks at Luke and says, "Where did you dig up that old fossil?" In reference to Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Right.
Now, one of the greatest roles that I have ever seen played by any actor is Samuel L. Jackson, of course, in Pulp Fiction. But I had a dream one night that I was standing there and I was witnessing that scene in the beginning, shortly in the beginning, where they go and they retrieve the briefcase, and he does his line. And I had for some reason in my dream, it was Gene Wilder in that role, and he was screaming that, and I will strike down that man with great vengeance, but he's doing it as he was screaming in Young Frankenstein. So
Frankenstein.
Is Dr. Frankenstein.
I was like, get my creation! Why? This was a massacre. I don't know, it was just a weird dream I had the one time, but I thought, oh, that would be interesting to see that. Of course, we never will now, but...
Well, in some
I don't
other...
know. Now they got those deep fakes, so maybe they can do it. I don't know.
Yeah, well, in some other reality, in some other universe, maybe, it actually happened that way.
Well, no wonder. Hey, well, then no wonder
building.
aliens are visiting. No wonder aliens are coming here to see better actors in the role.
Yeah.
All right, man.
All right, so let's get back to some serious ghost talk here.
All right.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So wrote the book about the cemeteries. Pitched the idea of the book about the Franklin Castle, and this was interestingly, this came on the heels of Paranormal Lockdown came in and did an episode of the Franklin Castle, and so they came here and shot this, and when it aired, I was watching it, and I'm like, that's a little upsetting. Okay, well, they didn't put that in, and they didn't put that in, so I sent an email to Nick Groff. I kind of asked him a couple of questions. They actually had me come all the way to Cleveland from Putinbay to meet them at the house, walk through with them here at the house, and go through almost like a room by room tour of the castle and talk about the real history of the family. So when it aired, I'm not on there. I didn't give a damn either way. I've been on TV before. I will be again, so it doesn't matter. What I didn't like was the fact that I had told him that the story of Hannes Tiedemann, who built the Franklin Castle, being a murderer, is not true. They completely debunked that story, found out where it came from. And what did they do? They went with the original legend. So they also didn't thank John Myers, who was a contributor to the information I gave them. And they also didn't thank Professor Dora Levinson, who gave them photos, use of family photos. She's, as I mentioned, the great-granddaughter of Hannes Tiedemann and Louise, who built the castle. So I sent him an email, and he called back, and he's like, oh, yeah, our producer taped over your interview, so we didn't have anything to go on. We lost all your information. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, you guys sent me a questionnaire weeks in advance, and I sent you replies to all of this. You didn't lose it. It's bull crap. It's a load. It's not. So I'm like, okay, well, if anything else, this has inspired me to repitch the book to Arcadia History Press, who had already rejected it once. So I threw it at them, and they said, hey, it's too many words. If you can get it down to 54,000 words, we'll publish it. Hey, wonderful. So I called up John Myers, who had written it with me, and we were on board. And they said, yeah, we'll have it out in about 2 years. And I'm like, okay, hold on. I'm like, I got another idea somebody threw at me. And they're like, well, what's that? I'm like, well, you can get this out a little bit sooner. I said, okay, what is it? And I pitched them Haunted Putinbay. So I spend half the year living in Cleveland here at Franklin Castle, and the other half of the year I live in Putinbay, Ohio, out on South Bass Island. So I work there seasonally as a ranger at a national monument. And a guy up there named Charlie Holbrook, who runs the visitor center, had thrown the idea. He's like, maybe you should do like a ghost walk or something up here. Sure, there's all kinds of ghost stories. And I started probing around that summer, and sure as hell, yeah, there was a bunch of them. And I'm like, well, that's enough to write a book about. So when I threw History Press the idea for doing a book on the castle, and they said, well, it's going to be, yeah, sure. We can get it out in 1.5 to 2 years. I said, okay, well, here's one you can get out in about a year, right? And they said, yep, we can do that. So I threw them Haunted Putinbay. So I spent the entire summer collecting those stories from islanders, doing research on the history of these places, but getting these interviews over a few bottles of wine or a number of drinks and shots. Got some great stories. So the following spring, Haunted Putinbay came out, and then that following fall, the book about the castle came out. That was 2017.
So besides
the
fact that you, I think, live a life that is envious of all young men getting to live half the life on Putin Bay, half your year on Putin Bay, and then the other half in a haunted castle. Do you ever sit back and say, "Man, I got it pretty good"?
Yeah, I do every once in a while. So it's kind of like one of those things where, you wake up in the morning and it's like, pinch me. It's like, wait, am I really here? Yeah.
So
honestly speaking, both Putinbay, my job up at Putinbay is like a dream job. I mean, it really is. Where I work, I can't believe half the time that they're actually paying me to do this. It's the best in the world. I meet some of the nicest people. But then, when the season's over, I come back here to Cleveland, and I'm a resident historian at the castle, and it's great. So I sign books in the fall and winter and spring, and give lectures and whatnot. And I'm always working on new books. So. Yeah, it really is. It's something else.
So now, are there ghosts? Do you do then the ghost walks up at Putin Bay then?
I do. Yeah, we start. I was approached right around Easter of last year. One of the girls over on the island, she works at the boardwalk. Victoria Zakharova, Vika, to her friends. She approached me. Her friend Jimbo. And she had asked me about she wanted to do a historic village walk, like a history walk of the village. And so, it'd be something that we can offer people. It's more families, something to give families something more to do. And she's like, but I need to know more about the history. So he's like, well, hey, talk to Guinness Bill. He's my nickname up there. He's like, hey, yeah, he knows all the history around here. So she hit me up and asked me if I'd be interested. I said, yeah. And so we went and to get approval from the village, went before the council and everything. And we had talked about this right beforehand and said, hey, we can also possibly throw a ghost walk in there too, or something to do. And said, yeah, that'd be great, So we threw that. We threw that at them, and when we mentioned the ghost walk, they were really on board and stuff. I'm glad we did, because the historic village walk, where we dress up in period costume and lead people on a walk of the village on Tuesday afternoons, we didn't get a lot of interest in that, but we were slammed on Friday nights though for that ghost walk. So the ghost walk kind of saved us. So we've kind of deep sixed for now the village walk, and now we're doing the ghost walk on Tuesday nights and on Friday nights at Putin Bay. As long as we can gather in groups of more than 10 when the season starts. We'll see how this goes. So,
what?
Now it's the haunted. It's officially the haunted Putin Bay Ghost Walk. So,
what is your? Let me ask you a couple questions here. Then, what's your favorite haunted story from Putin Bay?
Oh, and gosh. That's a hard one.
And then I'll follow this up. And then what? Did you, in writing the book, did you just go talk to people and get stories, or did you actually go do any kind of investigating and see if some stuff was valid?
It was okay. Great, both great questions. Let me see. One of my favorite places, one of my favorite ghost stories up there, would have to probably by far be chapter 1. It's the first story in the book. It's the Park Hotel. It's a remarkable building. It's one of the oldest continually operating hotels in the state of Ohio. Dates from the 1870s, and it is still in operation since the 1870s. So it's about to celebrate 150 years here in a few years. That has a lot of activity. I mean, it has history to back it, tragic events throughout its history, but changing hands, colorful owners. The island itself is remarkable, but then the reports of paranormal activity are fantastic over there as well, what people have reported. It's one of my favorite places on the tour, more so than the Cursed Fountain. And I only say it's cursed because that's where I proposed to my ex-wife. Let's see. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I throw that one on the tour every time. The Monument, Perry's Monument, has ghost stories about it. What this was as far as my research, it was getting a lot of the stories from people. There were some places that, as you read, like the existing island guides, that say that the Doler House is a haunted, and then the Crow's Nest, which is a private club. It used to be a hotel. Is a friendly inn. Is also haunted. And that there was a cemetery across the street from it. Then there are stories from rangers at the monument who had said, that they witnessed this and they witnessed that. Talks about the Park Hotel, Ashley's Island House. There are all these stories that were already there that I stumbled on. But when I started doing the research, so the first year, right before I pitched it to the publisher, I didn't know that there really were that many stories. And then everybody came out of the woodwork when I was writing this and said, oh, yeah, no, you got to check out, you got to talk to this person, or you got to talk to this person. And some of these stories did go back many years. But of all the stories that I wrote about, I missed the one that was one of the most important ones. And I won't go into great details of it because I am going to be putting it in a future book. Just to clarify, though, I'm going to take a step back from writing ghost stories for a couple of years. I'm still working on them, and I've got one great book in mind right now. But I did find a story of a haunting at Putinbay in a few newspaper articles from 1891, and it has not been written about since. And I am like, where the hell is this? And I'm looking up every historic map, and I'm looking at property owners that are mentioned in the article, and lo and behold, I find it. And my friend Steve, who I work with, he works in the maintenance department. He lives right next door to it at Putinbay. And it's like, oh my God, this is remarkable. This is incredible story. So, and I'm so pissed off at myself though, because I missed it when I wrote a book called Haunted Putinbay, and I didn't put it in there. So,
well, you know what?
What I did,
we'll blame that on your ex-wife.
Yeah, this one will be in. This will be in my next book. I just was finally able to announce last week because it was official that I do have a new book coming out for Memorial Day weekend of 2021 called Lost Putinbay. Now, when I say I'm not writing ghost stories for a little while, I'm taking a back seat on that. Doesn't mean that I'm not going to tell ghost stories, because I will put that in the book. So you'll see that in about a year when it comes out. So that story will be there under the section for attractions, but otherwise it's going to be a story. The book will be about sites and attractions and things like that on the island that are no longer there or are no longer open to the public. So that's going to be more site histories, like the cemetery book, only not as creepy, I guess. I don't know why people always think cemeteries are creepy. I don't know. So that'll be out, Memorial Day of next year. So I did do a lot of research with sitting down and interviewing people, and it was usually over a few glasses, and my little voice recorder, which I used to use for trying to catch EVPs, and because I had to interview people. And I was really glad that one of the people that I did interview, though, Terry, he passed away the following spring. But I felt really privileged to be able to sit and talk with him as he shared his stories of the Dora house where he used to live up at Putin Bay, which is now the Putin Bay Winery. That's what it's called.
Oh, okay.
And right. he did live there. It's an old historic home. In fact, part of that house is the oldest standing structure in the village. So it was added on to, but it's the early 1850s. So you did have some stories about that place.
So did you go and do any snooping around and seeing if any of the places were really as haunted as what people claimed, or not?
Personally speaking, I'm not exactly a paranormal investigator. Not in the sense that I have the patience to sit for hours and ask questions into an empty room and hope to God that when I play back and I spend another 3 hours playing back the tape, that I might catch something that sounds like that, and I hear something and I get something out of it. I don't really have the patience for that, which is interesting, because what I do have the patience for is spending about 10 or 12 hours in front of a computer trying to track down who's buried in an old graveyard when there's no stones there, but finding out who owned the land and who those people are. So I'm more of a historian. I do have a friend. Now, this was after the book came out. about a year later, I met a girl, Christina Johnson, CJ, who came up there, and she's got her own thing going called Baseline Investigations, and she's a softball player, so she's really into that. So she called it Baseline. So she was up there, staying at the Park Hotel late in the season, and was doing an investigation of it. And she came over to where I work and purchased a copy of my book, and asked me to sign it. And then so we had a big conversation, but I had to get back to work, so I suggested me the drinks later. And we met up for drinks, and then she had invited me over to the hotel to go check out some of the places in the hotel. Now I used to stay there a few times, and it appears in my third mystery novel as a place, and there's a fictional character based on the actual manager. Anywho, there is a staircase in that hotel, and it's not the grand staircase in the front where you go from the lobby up to the upper floors, but there was a staircase in the back of the hotel that was a servant's stairwell, and it went from the servants' quarters up into a back hall. And that way the servants could come up and clean the rooms, and they're not using the front lobby, so you don't see a bunch of servants walking through the lobby. Some years ago, that stairwell was sealed up at the Park Hotel, and it's accessible through the back of a closet. You got to move this and move that, and then next thing you know, you're in a sealed up area where there's a stairwell. The interesting thing about this was some years ago, a woman was walking past the Park Hotel and came in and approached the poor girl working behind the counter and said, "Hey, I'm a medium, and you have this girl caught in the stairwell." And she just looks over at the stairs and says, "What are you talking about?" She's like, "No, not these. There are other stairs somewhere in this hotel, and there's somebody that's stuck there." She's like, "Okay, well, whatever," and just kind of dismissed her. Her uncle worked at the restaurant across the street, so she went over and asked him. And he's like, "That's interesting, because a few years ago we sealed up a stairwell and it's still there." So when I was there with Christina Johnson with Baseline Investigations, and she was doing her paranormal investigation of the Park Hotel, I got to see the stairwell, and she was trying to get some EVP recordings. So that's the closest I've ever came to actually doing a paranormal investigation at any places there. Otherwise, it's me kind of hanging out late night towards the end of the night as people are closing. We might have a few things happen. I did put a couple of my own personal experiences in there, but I changed my name in it because I don't like to write about myself. So I gave. There's a park ranger at the monument named Martin, and there's a story about his first shift as a fee collector when the stanchion rope gets thrown across the landing. There is no Martin. That's actually me. So I just picked the name. And
really?
I didn't say, and I have my own experience. I just made up a name for myself. And then there's another scene that happens over at Joe's Bar where a door opens on its own going to the upstairs, and a patron gets up and closes it and latches it, and then a few minutes later it does it again. I was that patron. So I did have my own experiences and continue to, which is interesting, mostly at work or occasionally when closed, like sitting there near closing time at one bar or another. So, but some of the places, I don't know the owners. Some of the places are, like, one of them is a private residence. I've only been inside them once. And, so I did have a few experiences, but mostly it was, interviewing people who had their own experiences.
So that then, I guess, would lead us to finally having the book on the Franklin Castle published. Okay. So I haven't read the book.
Right.
So is that book more of a history of the castle, or is it a history and debunking some of the rumors? Does it tell some ghost stories in that, or what? What's that?
The answer to your question is yes. It's all of those. It is. It is a complete conglomerate of everything you just said. It is history of the house. Okay, well, I start with the the generic legend of the Franklin Castle being everything that you're going to read online. If you go to, like, Google it, you're going to find that generic legend of Hannes Tiedemann, the original owner, being a murderer, killing a servant girl named Rachel and a niece named Karen, 3 kids mysteriously dying in 1883, his daughter and his mother dying in the house in 1881, Nazis, mass executions.
Wait a second, Nazis? Did you say Nazis?
Yeah, Nazis. Yeah. Apparently there were Nazis here during World War II using the house for spying reasons.
Wow.
Then there's secret passages galore and vaporous mists and bones found in the walls in the 70s, and a church and a police chief that owns it, and huge parties and people getting driven out of the house after just owning it for weeks. That's the first chapter, is all these huge legends. So we reiterated that, John and I. And then we would conclude that with it's a great story, but hardly a word of that is true. We then spend the rest of the time, we go back to the very beginning, since all the legends of the haunting go back to the original owner, Hannes Tiedemann, and his family. He is such a big part of the story. I mean, everything always points back to him being a murderer, and that's why it's haunted. We go from the very beginning of the book. Who was Hannes Tiedemann? Where did he come from? What is his story? Because his story is incredible. So we spend about the first half of the book talking about this guy and his family, who he really was, everything. It's a fantastic story. All the amazing crap that went into this building of the house, what it looked like, where else he lives, because he had another house built over in Lakewood, the next town to the west of us. His family, we used family letters, photos that have never been seen before, because the house is supposedly haunted by the wife and daughter of Mr. Tiedemann. And nobody had ever seen what they actually looked like. So we show those pictures in the book. So for the first time ever, people got to see those photos, given to us by the family, who, while doing the research, John and I became friends with. They were fantastic people. They were really nice. Despite the legend, which states that Hannes Tiedemann outlived every member of his family, it's not true. He was survived. It is true that he did survive beyond the life of his first wife and all 6 of his children, but he was survived by a second wife, a son-in-law, a daughter-in-law, and 6 grandsons. And all but one of those 6 grandsons had children of their own, and it's of those children that we became friends with while doing the research, who helped us out immensely with the book. So that takes about the first half of the story. And then we clear up the story about the Nazis. They weren't Nazis. They were German socialists. It was a singing society that had the house. There was a widow of a brewer. There was a doctor who has never been mentioned in any of the books until now. Then we start getting into the ghost stories, because those really ramp up in the second half of the story. That's when the story of the haunting really got public. But it turns out we did some research and we found out that the story of the haunting goes back about 50 years earlier to sometime between 1915 and 1921, when that doctor who always got overlooked, when his family lived here, his daughter-in-law, who lived well into the 1990s, used to tell her great-granddaughters about when their family lived here and about how their blankets got ripped off them in the middle of the night and how things would get tossed around all the time. They only lived here for 6 years, and they got out.
So you're saying
they were never mentioned in any book, any story, any article until John and I tracked them down and found out. And it was very helpful because one of those great-granddaughters that she had talked to was a girl that I went to school with, my friend Kim. So that was very helpful. And I'm like, are you serious? And she's like, yeah. She showed me her great-grandfather's World War I draft registration, and it has 4308 Franklin Boulevard. I'm like, yep, there he is, Leroy Shirky. And there's son of the doctor. Like, yep.
So the house had ghost activity clear back then.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's all the time we have for this week's episode. Tune in next week to the conclusion of this exciting interview with WilliamGKrejci. In the meantime, chime in with a comment or visit our discussion page on Facebook called After the Shadows. Don't forget to tell a friend about the From the Shadows podcast. And as always, your support is very much appreciated. And until next time, don't shy away from what may be lurking within the shadows. We are out.